Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for attending this presentation. My name is Konstantina Iliopoulou, and today I will present the study we've conducted together with Professor Konstantinos Tsioumis. The title of the presentation is Shaping Civic Identities Through Language, Literature, and History. In service, philology teaches conceptions of citizenship in multicultural and multilingual contexts. In increasingly multicultural classrooms, citizenship is no longer taught only through formal civics lessons. Instead, it is negotiated daily through language, literature, and history teaching. The study identifies four interconnected gaps in the literature. First, a level gap, since secondary education remains underrepresented compared to primary education research. Second, a disciplinary gap, because the distinct contribution of language, literature, and history is often overlooked. Third, a contextual gap concerning differences between urban and rural school settings. And finally, an agency gap, highlighting the need to better understand how teachers reshape their curriculum through their own professional practices. The study had two main aims. First, to explore how philology teachers conceptualize citizenship and the role of education in shaping civic identities. And second, to examine how they translate curriculum into practice within multicultural classroom environments. The research was guided by four main questions concerning teachers' conceptions of citizenship, their selection of teaching materials, their participatory pedagogical strategies, and the challenges they encounter while implementing citizenship education. Moving on now to the methodology of our study, it follows a qualitative research design. Data were collected through three semi-structured focus groups involving 15 in-service philologists working in secondary education within the Greek educational system. Two focus groups represented urban and multicultural school environments, while the third represented a rural and less diverse context. Participants had teaching experiences ranging from 3 to more than 25 years. The data were analyzed following Brown and Clerk's framework. From the analysis, five major analytical axes emerged. These are the following: conceptions of citizenship, curriculum interpretation, strategies of participation, structural constraints, and enacted citizenship practices. The findings are based on inductive thematic analysis. Starting with the first axis, it concerns teachers' conceptions of citizenship. Teachers working in urban and multicultural schools tend to approach citizenship in more action-oriented ways, emphasizing participation, social engagement, and active involvement in contemporary issues. By contrast, teachers in rural and less diverse schools emphasize reflective understanding and gradual engagement before action. In this context, critical reflection and conceptual understanding were viewed as necessary preconditions for meaningful civic participation. Overall, although both groups valued citizenship education, they approached participation through different pedagogical perspectives. Moving on to the next axis now, it concerns curriculum mediation and material selection. Teachers in multicultural schools frequently supplemented official textbooks with immigrant narratives and socially relevant materials in order to connect classroom content with students' lived experiences and contemporary social debates. By contrast, teachers in rural and less diverse schools emphasize conceptual clarity, structured understanding, and gradual engagement before action. Overall, these differences suggest that context shapes what we describe as different forms of philological habitus, with teachers functioning either as mediators of multiple perspectives or as bridge builders towards reflective understanding. The third axis now focuses on pedagogical strategies regarding participation. In urban and multicultural school settings, teachers emphasize simulations, collaborative learning, and open classroom dialogue as ways of promoting democratic participation and student engagement. In rural settings, participation tended to be more structured and reflective, with greater emphasis on guided discussion and gradual engagement. Overall, participation in this axis emerged in both contexts, but through different pedagogical rhythms and expectations. Now, let's move on to the fourth axis, which is about structural constraints. Teachers in urban schools mainly refer to the lack of multicultural representation in textbooks and the challenge of managing diverse classrooms. In rural schools, participants emphasized time pressure, curriculum demands, and limited institutional flexibility. Despite these constraints, teachers continue to create what we describe as pockets of agency through curriculum adaptation and dialogic classroom practices. The fifth axis, which is the final one, concerns how citizenship was enacted through classroom practice. Across the data, we identified multiple pathways to citizenship, including experiential projects, structured dialogue, community action, and advocacy writing. What is especially important here is that these practices became connected differently to each philological discipline. In the next part of the presentation, I briefly discuss how language, history, and literature each shaped distinct civic orientations and forms of participation. Now, let's start with language. Teachers framed language teaching as a space for democratic participation and civic communication. Students engaged in debates on migration and rights and European identity, while dialogue-based activities encouraged negotiation, argumentation, and respect for different perspectives. In multicultural classrooms especially, language became not simply a means of communication, but also a tool for civic participation and public expression. At the same time, teachers in rural contexts emphasized structured comprehension, a gradual positioning before open debate. So, participation through language emerged both as communicative practice and as reflective preparation for civic engagement. Moving on to the next discipline now, history teaching by contrast was associated primarily with critical literacy and the questioning of dominant narratives. Teachers described using multiple historical sources in order to help students compare perspectives, evaluate interpretation, and connect historical events with contemporary civic issues. Rather than treating citizenship as something external to the lesson, participants often integrated civic reflection directly into historical inquiry itself. In this sense, history education became a space for developing critical consciousness and interpretive judgment. And finally, literature. It was strongly connected with empathy, reflective engagement, and perspective-taking. Teachers described activities in which students explored refugee experiences, marginalized voices, and questions of identity through literary texts. In several cases, literary discussion also led to broader civic reflection and small-scale social initiatives. Thus, literature functioned as an important space for emotional engagement and reflective citizenship. Overall, the findings suggest that each philological discipline contributes differently to citizenship education. Language primarily supported communication, argumentation, negotiation, and democratic interaction. Literature fostered empathy, ethical reflection, and multi-perspectivity. History emphasized critical literacy, analytical thinking, and interpretive judgment. Citizenship education, therefore, emerged not as a single pedagogical model, but as a multidimensional process which is shaped by disciplinary practices and contextual realities. This slide captures the tension between structural constraints and teacher agency. Under time pressure, exam focus, and homogenized materials, teachers create pockets of agency through inclusive materials, teachable moments, and safe spaces. The findings are based on a relatively small group of motivated educators and therefore cannot be generalized broadly. Future research could combine teacher narratives with classroom observation in order to explore more closely how civic identities are negotiated under real pedagogical conditions and institutional constraints. Here we can see some of our references, and we would like to thank you for attending our presentation.